The rain in Dublin didn't fall so much as it drifted, a fine gray mist that clung to the windows of Euston Station like sweat on a dying man. Roisin checked her watch. 11:43 p.m. The last train to Westport was a ghost of a service, usually reserved for shift workers, tired students, and those who had lingered too long in the pubs of Temple Bar. She hauled her suitcase onto the carriage, the hollow thud of her boots echoing against the metal floor. The train was nearly empty. She chose a carriage near the middle, carriage D, and took a window seat. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and that peculiar metallic scent of old Irish rail upholstery. As the train groaned to life and lurched out of the station, the city lights began to blur into a smear of orange and yellow. Soon, the urban sprawl gave way to the deep, suffocating blackness of the Midlands. In Ireland, the night isn't just dark, it's heavy. It's a thickness that feels like it's trying to reclaim the tracks. Roisin leaned her forehead against the glass. Her own reflection stared back, pale and tired, superimposed over the rushing shadows of the bogland. Then the flickering began. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed, buzzed, and died for a heartbeat. When they kicked back in, the carriage felt colder, a lot colder. Roisin pulled her cardigan tighter. She looked down the aisle, expecting to see a ticket inspector or a stray passenger. There was something at the far end of the carriage. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a smudge on her glasses or a reflection of a bag in the overhead rack. But it wasn't on a rack. It was in the middle of the aisle, about 5 feet off the ground. It was a piece of clothing, a shawl, perhaps, or a heavy woolen wrap, the kind her grandmother might have worn to mass in the 50s. It was a dull, bruised purple, and it was floating. It didn't drift like a balloon. It hung with a terrifying static rigidity. There was no wind in the carriage, no draft to explain the way the fabric rippled slightly at the edges, as if it were submerged in water. Roisin froze. "Hello?" she whispered. Her voice was swallowed by the rhythmic of the wheels. The object began to move. It didn't turn. It simply started to glide toward her. It moved with a slow, predatory grace, maintaining its height perfectly. As it got closer, Roisin realized with a jolt of pure, primal fear that the shawl wasn't empty. There was a shape beneath it. Not a solid body, but a suggestion of shoulders, a hint of a bowed head. But where the face should have been, there was only a cavernous tuck in the fabric, a shadow so deep it seemed to pull the light out of the air. She stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs, like a trapped bird. She moved to the door leading to carriage C, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the handle. She yanked it open and stepped through, the roar of the tracks momentarily deafening as she crossed the coupling. She slammed the door shut and peered through the small, reinforced glass pane. The shawl was gone. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Just tired," she muttered to the empty carriage. "Just the bog eyes. Too much caffeine." She sat down in carriage C, facing the door she had just come through. She wasn't going to take her eyes off it. The train sped up, the engine howling as it cut through the darkness of Roscommon. Then she felt it. A soft, wet pressure against the back of her neck. It wasn't a hand, it felt like damp wool. Roisin didn't scream. Her throat had closed tight, a cold knot of ice blocking her windpipe. Slowly, agonizingly, she tilted her head back. The shawl was there. It wasn't behind her seat. It was above her, pressed against the ceiling of the train, spreading out like a dark stain. The bruised purple fabric was inches from her face now. She could smell it, a scent of stagnant bog water, old peat, and something metallic like copper or dried blood. A thin white strand, something that looked like a finger but moved like a maggot, unfurled from the hem of the garment. It reached out toward her eye. Roisin lunged from her seat, tripping over her own feet, and scrambled toward the front of the train. She ran through carriage B, then carriage A, her lungs burning. She reached the driver's cabin door and hammered on it. "Open up, please. There's something in here." No answer, only the rhythmic drone of the engine. She turned around. The entire length of the train was now visible through the open doors of the connecting carriages. And she saw them. It wasn't just one shawl anymore. There were dozens. They were drifting out of the floorboards, seeping from the air conditioning vents, and uncoiling from the luggage racks. A sea of bruised purple, gray, and charcoal rags, all floating at eye level. They moved in unison, a silent, spectral tide, filling the carriages until the windows were completely obscured by the heavy, weeping fabric. The lights flickered one last time and stayed off. In the sudden, absolute silence of the stalled train, Roisin heard a sound. It wasn't a moan or a hiss. It was the sound of 1,000 dry, rhythmic breaths, perfectly in time with the ticking of her own cooling heart. And then she felt the first cold woolen fold wrap around her ankles. The fluorescent lights of the 12:42 a.m. train flickered with a rhythmic, sickening hum. George leaned his forehead against the cold window, watching his own tired reflection ghost across the dark tunnel walls. He had stayed late at the firm again, chasing a promotion that felt more like a mirage with every passing hour. The carriage was nearly empty. A faint smell of ozone and old floor wax hung in the air. At the far end of the car sat a man in a tattered coat, sleeping with his chin on his chest. 2 rows ahead of George, a woman sat perfectly still. George didn't notice her at first. He was too busy rubbing the grit from his eyes. But as the train screeched around a sharp bend, the lights failed for a full 3 seconds. When they buzzed back to life, she was closer. She was now sitting in the row directly across from him. George froze. He hadn't heard her get up. He hadn't heard the rustle of clothing or the heavy thud of footsteps on the linoleum. She wore a high-collared Victorian-style dress of deep charcoal gray, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Her hair was a shock of midnight black, pinned up in an elegant, severe bun. "Long night," George muttered, his voice cracking from hours of silence. He tried to offer a polite, exhausted smile, the kind commuters use to acknowledge each other's shared misery. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even tilt her head. George felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. He turned back to the window, but the darkness outside offered no comfort, only the strobe-like flashes of tunnel lights passing by. He stole another glance at her. She was leaning forward now. Her posture was unnatural, her spine curved like a question mark. The wide brim of her hat cast a deep shadow over her head. But as the train passed under a particularly bright maintenance light, the shadow retreated. George's breath hitched. He felt his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. Where there should have been eyes, there was only smooth, pale skin. Where there should have been a nose, there were no nostrils, only a subtle, sickening indentation. Her mouth was a seamless expanse of flesh, as if the skin of her cheeks had simply grown over the opening, sealing it forever. It wasn't a mask, it was her head, a featureless, egg-like dome of translucent white skin that pulsed slightly with every beat of the train's engine. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead. "Hey," he gasped. "Hey, what are you?" The woman raised a gloved hand. She didn't point at him. Instead, she began to stroke her own smooth face. Her fingers traced where her eyes should have been, pressing deep into the soft, yielding flesh. The train began to accelerate. The screech of the wheels against the tracks rose to a deafening metallic scream. George looked toward the door to the next carriage, but the glass was frosted over with a thick, crystalline ice that shouldn't have been there. He looked back at the woman. She was standing now. Without a mouth, she began to make a sound. It wasn't a scream. It was a wet, muffled vibration coming from deep inside her chest, a low-frequency hum that made George's teeth ache. As she stepped into the aisle, the skin on her face began to stretch. Tiny, needle-like protrusions began to push from underneath her smooth visage, trying to break through the surface. It looked like hundreds of teeth were fighting to escape from behind her skin. George scrambled backward, tripping over his briefcase. He reached for the emergency brake, but his hand passed right through the handle as if it were made of smoke. "Next stop!" A voice crackled over the intercom. It wasn't the usual recorded conductor. It was a distorted, bubbling version of George's own voice. "Final stop." The woman reached out. Her gloved fingers touched George's cheek. Her touch was impossibly cold, like dry ice. "You've worked so hard, George," the muffled vibration seemed to say, echoing directly inside his skull. "You're so tired of looking at the world. Let me help you rest." George tried to scream, but as his mouth opened, he felt a horrific tightening in his jaw. He reached up, his fingers trembling, and felt his lips begin to fuse together. His nostrils narrowed, the air becoming thin and scarce. His eyelids grew heavy, not with sleep, but with the sensation of skin growing over his pupils, knitting itself shut in a seamless, fleshy veil. The last thing George saw before the world went white was the faceless woman sitting back down in her seat, her charcoal dress rustling softly as the train plunged into a tunnel that had no end. When the 12:42 a.m. reached the depot the next morning, the cleaners found only an empty carriage. There was no sign of George, only a leather briefcase sitting on the floor, and a single charcoal gray thread caught in the upholstery of a seat that still felt unnaturally cold to the touch. The date had been perfect, the kind of evening that felt scripted. Julius and Anna had spent hours tucked away in a dimly lit bistro, the air between them thick with the easy laughter of a burgeoning romance. When they finally stepped onto the platform of the midnight train, the city hummed with a quiet post-rain glow. "Last train of the night," Julius whispered, pulling his coat tighter. He squeezed Anna's hand. "Almost feels like we rented the whole line for ourselves." The carriage was nearly empty. A single flickering fluorescent bulb hummed at the far end, casting long, rhythmic shadows as the train lurched forward. They sat opposite each other near the middle of the car. Julius was still talking, recounting a funny story about his childhood, his face animated and warm. Anna smiled, nodding at the right moments, but her eyes kept drifting toward the window beside him. Outside, the world was a blur of black tunnels and passing concrete walls, but the interior light turned the glass into a dark, imperfect mirror. At first, she thought it was just the distortion of the glass. Behind Julius's reflection, sitting in the seat directly across the aisle from him, a seat that was physically empty, there was a shape. Anna blinked, her smile faltering. She shifted her gaze directly to the aisle seat. Empty. Just the cracked blue vinyl and the dusty floor. She looked back at the window. The figure was there. It was a woman, or what remained of one. She wore a dress that looked like it had been pulled through a meat grinder, stained a color so dark, it was almost black. Her skin was the gray of wet ash, clinging tightly to a skeletal frame. But it was the face that made Anna's blood turn to ice. The ghost wasn't just haunting the train, she was staring. Her eyes were wide, lidless, and rimmed with a raw, weeping red. Her mouth was pulled back in a permanent, jagged snarl, exposing teeth that looked like broken shards of yellowed bone. She looked absolutely, primally livid. "Anna? You okay?" Julius reached across the gap, his hand hovering near hers. Anna forced her eyes back to his. "Yeah, just tired. Long day. We're almost there," he said gently. She tried to listen to him, but her eyes were drawn back to the glass like a magnet. The figure had moved. In the reflection, the ghost was now leaning forward, her face mere inches from the back of Julius's head. She looked as though she were screaming, though the only sound in the carriage was the rhythmic of the wheels on the tracks. The ghost's fingers, long, needle-thin and tipped with blackened claws, began to reach out. In the reflection, they stroked the air around Julius's neck. Anna's breath hitched. "Julius, stand up." He frowned, confused. "What? Why?" "Just, let's move to the next carriage. This one smells like, I don't know, ozone. It's giving me a headache." Julius looked around, sniffing the air. "I don't smell anything, babe. We're only 2 stops away." Anna looked at the window again. The ghost had turned its head. It was no longer focused on Julius. Those weeping, red-rimmed eyes were now locked onto Anna's. The ghost's snarl deepened. In the glass, the figure stood up. It didn't walk. It twitched, its limbs snapping into place with unnatural angles. It began to crawl over the back of the seat toward Julius, its movements jittery, like a film skipping frames. The train entered a long tunnel. The lights in the carriage flickered and died for a heartbeat. In that second of darkness, Anna heard it. A low, wet, rasping sound right in front of her. The lights buzzed back on. The seat next to Julius was still physically empty, but in the reflection, the ghost was sitting right beside him. She had her arm hooked through his, her head resting on his shoulder. Her terrifying, angry face was tilted up, staring directly at Anna through the window glass. Then, the ghost raised a finger to its mangled lips. Shh. With her other hand, the reflection of the ghost reached out and touched the glass from the inside. A smudge appeared on the window. A real physical smudge of gray, oily residue. "Julius, get up! Now!" Anna screamed, lunging across the aisle and grabbing his arm. "Whoa! Anna, what's wrong?" He stood up, startled by her sudden violence. "Look!" She pointed at the window. "Look at the glass!" Julius turned. The smudge was there, a perfect, hand-shaped print. But the reflection showed only him and Anna. The ghost was gone. "It's just a dirty window, Anna. Calm down," Julius said, though his voice wavered. He saw the terror in her eyes. Okay. Let's go to the front car." They began to walk, their footsteps echoing in the metallic hallway. Anna kept her head down, refusing to look at any more windows. They reached the heavy sliding door to the next carriage. Julius pulled it open, ushering her through. As the door hissed shut behind them, Anna couldn't help it. She glanced back through the small porthole window of the door. The carriage they had just left was no longer empty. Every single seat was now occupied by the gray, ashen figures. Dozens of them. They were all standing, their bodies twisted, their faces distorted by that same mindless rage. And at the very front of the crowd was the woman in the shredded dress. She wasn't looking at Anna anymore. She was looking at the back of Julius's head, her mouth open in a silent, wide-arched howl of fury. And as the train slowed for their stop, Anna realized with a sickening jolt that the ghost wasn't just on the train. The woman's hand was still hooked firmly through Julius's arm, not in the reflection, but in the way his jacket sleeve was bunched up, pulled tight by an invisible, vengeful weight that followed him out into the night.